As you guys all know, I have had the Pixel Fold since pretty much launch day, and I have really enjoyed this device. It is rapidly becoming one of my favorite devices of all time, but that does not mean it's not fun to think about the future, to think about what is coming next. I can enjoy this device and still pontificate about what might be coming next, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. Because in this video, I'm going to give you sort of my wish list for the Pixel Fold 2. Not necessarily things that I think are super duper realistic, but my wish list. Things that in a perfect world we would get with the Pixel Fold 2. And we're going to start things off with the camera, because the camera is an area of this device that I have been largely pretty darn happy with. I do think overall it is a better camera setup than I was used to with the Z Fold devices, but there are some fairly large holes in this camera and in its functionality, its features, its performance that I think could be fixed and that would definitely be on my wish list. So let's start off by jumping over to GSM Arena, and we're going to look at the camera specs on the Pixel Fold. And for the most part, we're going to be looking at that primary camera because that's the one that I actually have most of my problems with. It is a 48 megapixel sensor, which in and of itself is fine. It is a sensor with 0.8 micrometer pixels, which aren't necessarily the biggest, and it is a 1/2 inch sensor, which makes it not a particularly large sensor. And if we look at the Pixel 7 Pro, that guy has a 50 megapixel sensor, which again, in and of itself, these things are equal. We're not really concerned about that number, but it is a larger sensor at 1/1.31 inches, and it has larger pixels at 1.2 micrometers. Now, of course, both of these devices do pixel binning. So instead of a 50 megapixel output, you get something else. You get something around 12 on both of these. So you take this 1.2 micrometers and you're going to be multiplying that, making that quite a bit larger as they do pixel bin. Okay, so what do I want to change with the Pixel Fold? I want a physically larger sensor with physically larger individual pixels that can then be binned into larger super pixels. And the reason I want this is because when you compare the Pixel Fold to the camera on something like the Pixel 7 Pro or the Pixel 6 Pro, which has a very similar setup, and maybe the exact same sensor actually, now that I'm thinking about it, you find that the Pixel Fold does have a few disadvantages. So one of the most obvious ones is mid-range zoom just isn't quite as good to me. Now, obviously, the Pixel Fold has that 5x optical, and that works really well. But what about 2x, 3x, 4x? They don't work quite as well. If you're sitting at 4x zoom, it doesn't look that great. When you jump to 5, it looks a ton better. And if you had a physically larger sensor, the details that you're going to be able to resolve are going to be better. Obviously, the resolution is there, but larger sensors with larger pixels can typically retain more detail, and that is really useful pretty much everywhere, but also in that digital crop, the digital zooming area of using this camera. What about other things that this is going to give you? How about faster shutter speed? I've actually found that in lower light, anything but perfect lighting, the shutter speed is a little bit lackluster. You're going to get a little bit of motion blur going on. Outside in good lighting, it's great. You can capture really good detail of moving objects, but when you come inside, things are not nearly as good. And speaking of low light, that is another good example too. Larger pixels, larger sensors can absorb more light and therefore perform better in low light. That should go without saying. So again, Pixel Fold wish list item number 1, larger sensor. Just give us the sensor from the Pixel 7 Pro or the Pixel 6 Pro, and that's going to be a pretty good improvement. Now, this next one is something there's actually been some light rumors around for a long time. Google Pixel users have looked across the fence over towards Samsung Galaxy phone users and saw what they could do with Samsung DeX, the desktop mode for those devices, and we have looked at them with a sense of jealousy, as Google has been working on a desktop mode built into Android, but it really has never gone all that far. And in fact, Pixel devices lack the ability to do display out over their USB-C port. New leaks indicate that's going to be changing with the Google Pixel 8, so you can plug your Pixel 8 into a USB-C cable and have video being carried across that, or a USB-C to HDMI cable to a monitor or a television. And this could indicate that desktop mode progress is being made. It is being worked on. Like I said, there have been some leaks in that direction. Wish list item number 2, give us a Samsung DeX equivalent on the Pixel Fold number 2. That would be a really, really big deal, especially if they're trying to take Z Fold users and convert them to Pixel Fold users. So many people I talk to say, until there's a desktop environment like DeX, I will not move away from these Samsung Galaxy devices. We know Google's worked on it. We've seen the leaks. Maybe it's actually going to be a thing. Now, this next one is something that hasn't bothered me as much as perhaps some other people, but I do hear complaints about it all the time, and I might as well throw it on the list because it wouldn't hurt, so why not? Let's talk about the Google Tensor. One of the biggest problems with it for a lot of people is the fact that it does generate a lot of heat. Well, heat typically also means inefficiency. If you're creating heat, you're not using that same amount of energy for doing stuff on the phone because some of that energy is uselessly turning into heat. So with Tensor 3, big item on the wish list is going to be better efficiency, which means less heat and better battery life. Personally, I think performance on the Tensor 2 is already more than fine. This thing opens apps, moves through multiple applications, jumps around and multitasks just as fast as the Z Fold or any other device I've ever used. Gaming performance isn't quite as good as on those other devices. I'm not really bothered by that. But if I can get better battery life and less heat generation, while I'm not like overheating and having any issues with anything like that, anything that extreme, I have seen other people with these issues and people who have had worse battery life than they were hoping for. So wish list item number 3, definitely better efficiency with the next processor, which means less heat and better battery life. Another one I've heard plenty of complaints about is in regard to the brightness of the screens. Now, on paper, the Pixel Fold has a couple of screens that are pretty darn bright, brighter than the Z Fold 4 was. But the problem is, in practice, that's not really the case. And this kind of goes back to, I guess, the biggest problem I have with thermals from the last item kind of leads back into this. It hits that peak brightness, which I think is like 1750 nits or something like that. But it gets too warm too quickly, and then it drops down to a much lower brightness. So what I find is that when I'm outdoors, I pull the phone out to check it. It's plenty bright. But if I need to use it for more than about a minute, it's going to get much dimmer, and I typically have sunglasses on, and at that point, I may be doing this thing so that I can see what I'm doing a little. I'm also, like, blind, so I have to, I'm up, like, much closer than I probably need to be, so I look ridiculous. And that would be nice to see that fixed. Devices like the Z Fold 5 have even higher brightness now than this, and they can maintain it for much longer. So we need to get the peak brightness, maybe can stay the same, but we need to have the longevity of that peak brightness stay where it is for much, much, much longer. It needs to be like several minutes instead of like 45 seconds to 60 seconds. That's just not good enough for most people. It doesn't bother me that much because when I'm outside, I tend to be doing short interactions with the device, but for a lot of other people who want to use their device more outside, it is a big problem, and you have that glossy looking screen protector that has a lot of reflections on it, picks up fingerprints really bad. It's kind of a recipe for disaster for some people. So the next item, I think we're on number 4, much longer sustained peak brightness on both screens. So for the rest of these, we're going to switch to this overhead camera. One of the biggest things I would love to see them implement is a change to how apps decide whether or not they should be continuing back to the cover display. Let me show you what I mean. If we open up YouTube, I've got a video going here, a recent video on my wife's YouTube channel, which you should go check out. She plays video games. Sometimes I'm on there. If we open up this device, obviously it's going to continue onto that tablet screen. Now, if I close it, since this is a media app running, it will continue back to this screen. Now, if we do this with a different application, let's just use Feedly where I get my news from, and we do the exact same thing. We're going to continue to the inner display, but when I close it, it's just going to lock the device. There's no way for me to get that to continue because it's not playing any media. I'm stealing this next one directly from my buddy Ike. I'll drop a link to their YouTube channel down below because they mentioned this in a recent video and I thought you were absolutely correct. With the Oppo Find N and Find N2, if you do the exact same thing, what happens is you get a little icon, a little thing pops up on your cover display, sort of almost like an always-on display look. I think it's monochrome. And if you double tap it, it will carry that app over to the cover display. So you can choose app by app, circumstance by circumstance. Do I want this to carry over or not? Instead of automatic for multimedia and automatically not for everything else, which honestly I don't really think is all that good. Sometimes, even when I'm playing a YouTube video, closing it should just lock the device. I would love to be able to just double tap to choose what I'm trying to do. So number 5, more manual control over what apps continue to the cover display. Something else we can steal from other devices like the Z Fold and the Surface Duo are app pairs. Now, we've heard that this was supposed to be in the works for a long time. We were hoping it would make it onto the Android 14 release, but it is seeming like that is not going to happen. Insiders like Michal Rahman saying it is still being worked on, so we should not expect it at that initial release, but it needs to come very, very soon, hopefully much sooner even than the Pixel Fold 2. What we're talking about is the ability to have one icon that when you hit it, it launches 2 apps at once. Perhaps every time you get in your car, you open up your text messaging app and Google Maps or something like that, rather than having to open up that text messaging app and then grab the Maps app and drag it up. Have one icon that opens them both up at the exact same time. Very, very useful for some circumstances, and it's something that we need pretty much now. So number 6, we need app pairs. How about a floating application? I do this all the time on my Z Fold because sometimes having 2 apps side by side is great, but sometimes you want an app to be full screen with a floating app on top. Like maybe you've got Twitter going, and this is what I do a lot. I use the Wise app. I'll drag it up into a floating app instead of into a side-by-side app, and it allows me to jump into a particular camera and sort of have it floating in this little box somewhere where I can place it. Really useful, and it's one of the biggest things I miss from the Fold 4. So guys, there you go. That is my wish list. 7 things I really want to see on the Pixel Fold 2. If you've got your own wish list of items, drop those in the comments down below. We can talk them out. Subscribe before you go. I will see you on the next one. And until then, stay nerdy, my friends.